So very pleased to have our guest today. Okay, just let that go. So very pleased to have with us today Mike Klein, who's going to talk about a radical manifesto for internal communications. So I'm happy to pass over to you now, Mike.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank you for having me today. And also, I wanted to talk with you about a radical manifesto for internal communications in less than 30 minutes. What does that look like? Well, let's take a look at what a manifesto is for a second. A manifesto, like they know it in British politics, is a set of beliefs, ideally a set of beliefs that the issuing party actually intends to follow. And we're not going to go into the state of UK politics at the moment because we only have about a half hour. But for me, the radicalness of this manifesto requires two things. First is a rethink of who we are as internal communication professionals. We aren't the corporate megaphone or the leadership minutes taker. We're not the distribution or the design department. We are leaders with agency and the capability to take initiative. And we're also among the few people, be we in-house or consultants, who have the ability to generate a 360-degree review of the business. The second rethink involves what we do and how we do it to fit with that rethink of who we are. And this manifesto is a reflection of that rethink. So here's the manifesto. Maybe it takes about 3 minutes. And then if you have any questions, great. Otherwise, I can explain each of the points in some more depth. So the first point is that the rules of internal communication are changeable. Leaders are changing, and we need to stay ahead of them. Second, our assumptions need to change. This means saying goodbye to think, feel, do, and saying hello to do, know, feel, say. Third is internal influence can't simply be driven from above. Line managers are not to be confused with influencers. Fourth, even though employee surveys can have hundreds of questions, only 2 questions really matter. 5, alignment beats engagement, especially from a big picture perspective. 6, super connection may be the single most powerful role of the communication professional and the best hidden opportunity. And number 7, the pursuit of increased employee engagement scores is the enemy of effective internal communication. So here to repeat. 1, the rules are changeable. Leaders are changing and we need to stay ahead of them. 2, our assumptions need to change. 3, internal influence can't simply be driven from above. Number 4, only 2 survey questions really matter. 5, alignment beats engagement. 6, super connection needs to become a priority and an opportunity. And finally, 7, employee engagement scores are the enemy. Does anybody have any questions?
If that doesn't prompt a few questions, I'd be surprised. So if we've got any questions coming in, do use the chat. Mike, I'm going to ask a question. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. You first, Michael, or me?
So what is, go for it.
Right, okay. I thought I'd kick us off with one of my questions. So you've mentioned the priority to performance disconnect gap, addressing that in your manifesto. So
correct.
How does this work when addressing disconnect or gaps in an era where there's a lot of change and uncertainty, where predetermined priorities are likely to change without much time to prepare?
Well, that actually ties into the question about the 2 survey questions that really matter that Jennifer Kennedy just asked as well. And those 2 questions are, one is, what are the 3 top priorities facing the business? And the second is, what are the 3 most important things you're doing in your job? Because when you're asking those 2 questions, there's a lot you're going to be able to find out, particularly if you're using open-ended questions or an open-ended approach to answering those questions. So if you ask people, what are the 3 biggest priorities facing the business? There are 2 main things you're looking for. One is, do the employees use the same set of priorities that the business uses? Is it is it in line with what the business is saying? Second is, what language are the employees using? What words are the employees using to describe those priorities? So for example, companies talk in terms of transformation programs, but sometimes employees will come up with different views on what those transformation programs are about. They'll say, oh, you mean the damn cost cutting program? So you ask them in an open-ended question, the percentage of people saying the damn cost cutting program is going to be a finding at least as much as whether that transformation program is seen as one of the top three. Second is when you're looking at what the employees are saying about what they're doing, you can see, is there a direct, obvious connection between what employees say they're doing and how that lines up with the company's priorities? And that can open up tons of different angles from an internal comms perspective. Do you have misalignment between the work people are doing and the organizational priorities? Do you have middle management layers interjecting their own agendas, their own priorities that may misalign with those of the overall business? Or do you have people who see themselves as cleaning the parking lot rather than putting the man on the moon, as to paraphrase the old NASA example around alignment and purpose from years ago? There's a lot there if you ask these two questions. Further explanations of this, somebody asked if they want to hear further explanations of the 7 points of the manifesto. I can do that, but it'd be good to find out which you're most interested in, because we've got a limited amount of time here. And I can repeat them again if that will prompt a bit more questioning. So the first is, the rules of internal communication are changeable. Second, our assumptions need to change. Third, internal influence can't be driven by, simply be driven from above. Number 4, as we discussed, only 2 survey questions really matter. Number 5, alignment beats engagement. Number 6, super connection needs to become a priority and an opportunity. And number 7, employee engagement scores are the enemy. Any questions about any of these in particular?
I'm going to jump in with a question while we're waiting. I think the one that well, they all jump out at me. However, I love the one about actually leaders and influencers. I think often, I know we were chatting before about this, I think we know the importance, especially line managers play when it comes to internal comms. But I'm keen to hear actually some thoughts around how do we shift, I guess, our perceptions of line managers being the influencers to go, actually, who are the stakeholders and audiences that can become those influencers to really help?
Well, the key thing is that influence is driven by credibility as well as authority. And in many organizations and in many situations, it's the independence from authority that actually gives somebody credibility. So leaders like to focus on manager communication because they think it's something that they can control. But the reality of word of mouth in the organization is it's not something that can be controlled. It needs to be influenced, and you need to know who the people in the organization who have that influence are. You can't just simply assume that because somebody's in a particular position on a box and connected with a line, that they have much more influence than just simply the power to hire and fire and manage accordingly. And there are ways to find real influencers. You've got to do research. You can either do something called snowball research, which is where you ask people who they get their inspiration from, their support from, their knowledge from, and then you ask the people that they ask until you snowball it to get this, until the same names keep coming up. Or you can do full-blown organizational network analysis, which produces something like an airline route map, where you can see where who the 3% of your people are who drive 90% of your conversations.
Mike, there's another question that's come in on the chat. Can you define super connection?
Sure. Super connection it's really the most exciting opportunity that's available to internal communication folks these days. And it's about figuring out the audiences of two, the two people that you can think of at any given time who need to know each other and who can connect with each other and actually drive some change, some knowledge sharing, perhaps even some innovation in the business. In a time when you're having massive turnover in organizations, whether it's the great reshuffle, the great resignation, whatever, and you've got people working hybridly or remotely, getting new people introduced to the people who they need to know to be able to be effective is going to have so much bottom line measurable difference for internal comms folk that it's silly not to make it an instant priority. To give you an example, say for instance, you're an organization that's, it's got about 1,000 people and it's getting 100 new hires every month. If you increase the productivity of those new hires by 10% over 3 months, and everybody's making 5,000 a month, that's 1,500 per person times 100 people. That's your salary at least one time over, possibly twice if they're not being nice to you. So this is, everything else that you're doing, which is great. If you just add this bit, then you justify your own salary, and then you can get a hell of a lot more support from the organization to let you do the things that you need to do. So this is a real potential winner, and it's not hard to do. It just simply involves making sure that you're disciplined about introducing people and getting other people in the organization to do it as well.
Thanks, Mike. It's another question that's come in. Why does alignment beat engagement? Is it because you can measure alignment and not engagement?
Well, you can measure engagement all you want, but the question is whether the measurement has any value to begin with. But even more importantly, what does engagement buy you? If you've got a bunch of people who are really happy and they're not aligned, then you've got a headless chicken ranch. Or you've got a country club where everybody's sitting on the back, everybody's engaged, they're engaged in their pina colada, sitting back and enjoying being in an organization that treats them well, but they're not moving in the same direction, and they might not even be moving at all.
Thanks, Mike. And why do you have a different approach to internal comms regards to this whole manifesto?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I've been at internal comms for the last 20 years. I started in the UK, worked in the UK for 5 years after business school, and then proceeded to go back to the US and then move to Europe. And my background is political campaign consulting. And so the short answer is that I see internal communication as a function of individual agency, people having a choice. Just as in politics, people have a vote. In internal communication, people have a choice all the time about what they do and how they do it. But then there's also the overlay of group dynamics. Do you function as a member of a team, as a member of a function, as a member of a profession, as a member of an age cohort, a race, an ethnic minority, a professional specialty, or a supporter of a particular football side? Because all of those group dynamics are things that actually drive behavioral change quickly. I mean, I saw when I was working in the UK, there was a lot of interest in psychology. That's kind of morphed into an interest in neuroscience. And I don't discount the value of these things, but group dynamics are also equally powerful and actually add a lot more velocity to the conversation. And that's how I approach internal comms. And that's why, when I look at internal comms and see the stuff that's not really working, it's easy to come up with alternatives.
So do you have any examples of where you've tried this in reality?
Well, yeah, I've, in terms of finding influencers, I worked in a variety of organizations ranging from a global law firm to a global building materials company to an insurance company. How do you find people who participate in the organization versus the people who are just simply doing the doing? And the difference is that most of the, it takes relatively few people to drive a lot of the conversations, and everybody knows who those people are. and particularly the employees have a better view of it than say the managers or the HR departments. And I also work with other organizations that have a ton of experience in this area. For example, there's a company that does organizational network analysis called Innovisor out of Copenhagen. They've done this in hundreds of companies. And I've been working with and talking with them for about 10 years. So, that's just one area as an example, but also looking at, looking at open-ended survey questions. This past week, I've been working with a tech company, or this past month, I've been working with a tech company in London that does a really exhaustive employee engagement survey. But fortunately, they do a large number of open-ended questions that gave me some real data about, what's driving satisfaction, dissatisfaction, and what are some of the communication things that could happen that could quickly, shift attitudes in the organization. Open-ended research, when asked well, gives you a lot of opportunity for action.
Thanks, Mike. That's very comprehensive. There's a question that's come up regarding open-ended questions here. So the question is, if we ask the 2 open-ended questions that matter, can you recommend the best way to analyze the results?
Well, I think the best way to analyze them is to analyze them. You can do it yourself. There's a number of electronic ways of doing them, which I never use because I like analyzing open-ended questions, because it's just going through the questions, reading the wording, seeing where the common themes are. I mean, one of the things with open-ended questions is that you can't necessarily predetermine what the themes are going to be. You can anticipate them. You might have them on a list somewhere. But what I tend to do is I get a list of open-ended questions, put them in an Excel spreadsheet, and then when I find a recurring theme, I just start copying the text into the cells in the Excel spreadsheets. And eventually, in the case of the project that I've been working on, it took like about 300 questions and about 7 different categories emerged. And then I looked at, okay, how much of this is positive? How much of this is negative? And then, maybe that becomes 10 categories. You really, it really benefits from you immersing yourself in the data and building the analysis up from the data itself, rather than having a bunch of predetermined, approaches and then trying to guess where the questions fall. The key thing is what you're looking for. Is if you're asking these questions, the things you're looking for is alignment versus misalignment. Both alignment between people and the priorities, and alignment between people's work and the priorities. And if you can figure those things out, you then have wonderful verbatims that you can present back to senior management, because the key thing about open-ended data is you can turn it into numbers. So you can come up with a count of how many questions or how many mentions. You can do it either by people or by words, like how many times were certain negative or positive thoughts mentioned. Or you can just simply feed back the most powerful quotes. The senior management pop them into a PowerPoint slide deck. And then management realized, hey, this isn't as simple as we thought it was.
That's interesting. I mean, a typical annual survey usually has more quantitative questions than qualitative. So what, in your opinion, would be the balance in terms of, when you put together the trying to figure this whole thing out and ask the right questions to then get the right answers to see where the alignment is and where the misalignment is?
Well, I think the key thing with an employee engagement survey is that employee engagement surveys rarely chase organizational alignment. They're trying to chase how people feel about stuff. This is again why I say that, pursuing higher employee engagement scores is the enemy of effective internal communication. Because to get higher employee engagement scores, you've got to get everybody in the organization to feel the same way about something, basically. And the reality is that, if you're an organization, say for instance, you're a hotel chain, and the biggest opportunity for improvement is the food, there's not much that the chambermaids are going to be able to do about that. So they don't need as much detail about how improving the food in the restaurant service is going to do as the people who are actually working in the restaurants. So, this is what I'm talking about targeting. It's when you're targeting what people do, you have to be selective about the amount of effort that you place on them. Does that mean that it's not important to keep the chambermaids engaged? Well, it is, but that's not going to improve your restaurant score. So, it's really about quality. You need to bring a qualitative edge to it. And once you do that, if you're doing, and I'm not saying throw out your employee engagement survey,
No.
but if your employee engagement survey doesn't ask these questions, then you might need to ask 100, 200, 500 people in your organization these two questions separately from the employee engagement survey so that you can find out what the alignment issues are. And yes, there's a problem when you've got an employee engagement survey that's too long and people are burned out, but really survey fatigue burnout is more from the fact that most organizations don't pay attention or actually transparently engage with the data that they receive from their employees. When you're doing these kinds of surveys, is the alignment survey, it's going to be very hard not to show that you're acting on it, because if you've got misalignment and you're not going to act on it, then you've actually got kind of a misfeasance issue at management level.
So in terms of pushing the envelope, what if our manager won't let us do any of this?
Well, I mean, if you've got a manager who's not going to let you collect data, then you've got a real issue in your organization. Because, the job of internal communication is really to help improve the performance of the business. And if you can't adequately find out what's going on in the business, then internal comms has got to some other role, which may just be, how do we make management look good in the face of unknown drivers of performance? And you've got to ask the question, just from a shareholder value perspective, how are you adding value to the organization if you're not able to do that? Now, the reality is that you can have certain conversations informally, and you can nibble around the edges of some of this stuff. I'm not saying everybody should quit their job if they're not satisfied with the transparency level of their organization. But, there are things you can do in the margins. But the key thing is not to do things that are counterproductive, and trying to make everybody feel the same way so that you can get a higher employee engagement score is, that will help you get a higher employee engagement score. It's not necessarily going to improve your business. I had a little discussion last week, which is kind of illustrative. We were talking about the value of employee engagement scores. And I said, there's absolutely no causal relationship between employee engagement scores and organizational performance. And this person said, well, there's a strong correlative relationship. And I said, well, there's a strong correlative relationship between sunshine and happiness. Tell me which causes which.
Right, it's very interesting. There's a related question that's come in the chat. So with all of this, who is the friend of effective IC?
Measurement, good, strong measurement. Measurement that measures outcomes. Like you measure the words that are used, or measure the actions that are taken. And instead of benchmarking, you baseline. So benchmarking measures make zero sense when you've got organizations not only with different cultures, but now with different working styles, hybrid, remote first, office-based, 4-day a week, 5-day a week. There's the commonality of which you benchmark has deteriorated dramatically since the outbreak of COVID. But baselining, starting with where you are now in 2022, and then seeing how you perform month by month, quarter by quarter, year by year, that gives you some power and some influence.
So in terms of getting, the leadership buy-in, in terms of how do we understand what our expectations are as internal communicators in driving that change?
I think the key thing is to start to pilot, either to just start doing it without asking permission, or pilot it in a place where you can get the permission. The key thing with leaders, as I was saying, leaders are changing. We're now starting to see some changes in terms of generational background, in terms of gender, to a certain extent, ethnicity, culture, professional discipline. The one big change that I've seen in my own dealings with C-suite folks is they are much less interested in specifying approaches and more interested in results. They're not interested in you telling them how you're going to do something. They just want it done. And so that's a bit more pressure, but it's also a bit of an opportunity. You don't have to do it the same way we've always done.
I agree. It's always, what was that phrase again? It's always easier to ask for forgiveness and permission.
Seek forgiveness, not permission, but also seek permission when there is a need for it.
I agree. Yeah. You did mention, I see that we have another 3 minutes to 12:30. Time's gone by too quickly. You mentioned you had a few examples. Is this readily available for those who wish to see how it was done in other organizations, or would they need to speak to you one-to-one?
Very happy to speak with people one-to-one. There's also my ebook, which I did for Sparrow Connected, which is a leading IC platform company. We looked at employee engagement versus business impact. It's time to choose, which is the title of today's session. Because it's what it really comes down to. Do we want to impact the business directly, or do we think that by influencing employee engagement scores will somehow magically impact the business? My view is, let's go direct. Let's take it to the goal, and let's win out there.
Agree 100%. Thank you so much, Mike. Any other questions?
I think that's it, and we're coming pretty much to the close. So I think let's win out there is a good way to finish the session. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, Bino, for fielding the questions as well, and thanks for everyone who's posted questions as well. I think the final thing to say is we have recorded this session, so we can make that available afterwards. And I've also posted a link to Mike's ebook in the chat as well. And also just a reminder, if you want to find out more about the work of CIPR Inside, go to the website. You can find about it there. Anything you want me to add, Bino, to that?
No, I think we've pretty much covered everything, unless Mike has something, final words, last words, before we all call it an afternoon.
No, I think we're good.
Fabulous.
I really
Okay.
enjoyed that.
Anybody
Thank you
has
so
any
much.
questions, just you can find me at mklein818 on LinkedIn. That's the easiest place to find me.
Great. Thank you very much again, Mike. Okay.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everyone.
Thanks all.